Hi guys, this is Mrs. Beckvar going through today's lesson. I'm going to introduce the idea of development and measures of development. This ties really nicely in with industrialization. As countries industrialize, they are also typically becoming more developed. So I want to define for you what development is and then also talk about different ways that we measure a country's development. Some of this will be review from things we did earlier in the year. So when we say development, we want to have an understanding of what that means. The United Nations is an organization that we've really relied on for definitions of development and categories of development. So this is a really nice definition from the United Nations. It says development is one of the main priorities of the United Nations. What this is, it's a multidimensional undertaking to achieve a higher quality of life for all people. Economic development, social development, and environmental protection are interdependent and mutually reinforcing components of sustainable development. Okay, so there's a lot here. What you guys need to take away from this is that this is the idea that development is this higher quality of life for all people. So this ties into a lot of things we've already talked about this year. We talked about throwaway culture and how throwaway culture would be the opposite of sustainable development, right? It's treating people, it's treating the planet like they're disposable. Sustainable development in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is focused on economically advancing a country in a way that doesn't harm groups of people and allows people today, going back to our definitions of sustainability, allowing people today to meet their needs without taking away the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So what this says here is that, developing the economy, developing socially, developing environmentally, they're interdependent, meaning they work together, they depend on one another. So we can't successfully develop the economy and do that in a sustainable way with also considering the environment. And we have to protect the people that are involved in that, which would be the social component. The United Nations typically groups categories into different groupings here. Or if you just, if you Google development, you're going to see that different organizations talk about developed economies. On the UN list later today, you'll see also, highly developed or very highly developed. Economies in transition. So these are countries that meet some characteristics of developed economies, but also have some characteristics of developing countries. And then developing countries are the countries that are struggling the most in terms of their advancement. What developed economies typically have, a high per capita income. So per capita is the average, per person in the country. So generally, people are making a decent wages, decent income in developed economies. Poverty rates are low. There's a high standard of living. Narrow income inequalities, meaning we don't see this stark difference between the wealthiest and poorest people in the country. Low growth rate of population. If you think back to our population unit, you'll remember that as countries develop, that's a characteristic that we do see, that population rates tend to level off and decline, as particularly as women receive higher levels of education. You'd also see a low level of unemployment, and this is infrastructural capabilities are present. So there's infrastructure to meet the society's needs, whether that's having adequate living space. Going back to what you guys learned on Friday, in a crowded city, would be having proper ways of managing sewage, as an example, roadways. So the country is able to meet the infrastructural needs. So I skipped over the economies in transition because there's not a really nice way to define them. They're just kind of in the middle, and they have some, like I said in the previous slide, they have some characteristics of developing economies and some characteristics of developed economies, and they don't quite meet enough standard to be in either category. Developing economies, sort of on the lower end, are the opposite of what we just saw in the highly developed countries. So in these countries, we'd see higher rates of unemployment, lower wages, lower per capita income. This says dependence on the primary sector. What that means is it's a part of the economy. The primary sector would mean that most people are involved in things like agriculture, mining, fishing, forestry, hunting. and then dependence on exports, exporting the things that they're growing, and that's how they're making their money. So you're not seeing a lot of manufacturing, which would be the next step. So as countries began to, going back to industrialization, as countries began to increase their manufacturing, they moved from a developing economy more toward a developed economy. The most important measure of development that we're going to look at is the Human Development Index. We've already looked at this earlier in the year, the HDI. We did this in, I believe, our Q2 portfolio project, but I want to review for you what this is. This is a little background here. So it says the HDI was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not just economic growth. So HDI is important because it can help countries figure out the policy choices they're making. If we look at, how two countries with the same level of, I'll get to this, but gross national income per capita can end up with different human development outcomes. So what that means is, if we have two countries where people are basically making the same amount of money, they may actually look very different in terms of their human development index, because education rates may differ, health rates may differ, there may be stark differences in the treatment of men and women. So that also is why we can't just look at income alone. There are other social factors that are at play here when we look at development. This is the overall measure of HDI. It says that it's a summary measure of average achievement in 3 key dimensions: long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and having a decent standard of living. What this looks like. Long and healthy life is pretty simple. This is just life expectancy at birth. When we dig into this a little bit later, you'll also see that there's another component that takes into account maternal mortality rate, how are women being affected when they have children. But this, just for HDI, it's just how long is a person in a particular country expected to live when they're born. For education, there are 2 measures here. So one of them is mean years of schooling, or average years of schooling for adults over 25, and then expected years of schooling for children starting school. So this is really important. And even if you think about the United States, if you think about your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, and then beyond, you may see a pattern where your grandparents, or if you know your great-grandparents, there's a good likelihood that they received less education than your parents and than you will. So it's interesting to see if children who are starting school today are expected to complete more schooling than this number here, than the average number of years of schooling for adults over 25. We would expect this number to be lower than the expected years of schooling for a country that's developing, meaning over time, more and more people are going to school longer. And then the last one is standard of living, which is measured by gross national income per capita. What that means is simply this sentence here. It reflects the average income of a country's citizens. So, the more technical definition is the dollar value of a country's output of goods and services divided up by the population. So what it's intended to show is the average person's income. How much money does the average person have to meet their standard of living? All right, guys, so after this, what you're going to do is actually explore a little bit of HDI. You're going to go in and take a look at different countries and all the different levels of development and look at their characteristics and look at some of these numbers.